History doesn't always change with a bang. Sometimes it changes when someone finally admits this system isn't working. This is Dravin's Den. Welcome back to Dravin's Den. I'm your host, Stan. And I know I'm a day off. Yesterday was kind of one of those days where a bug decided to hitchhike along with me from over the weekend. But we're back, we're loud, and we're proud. And if this is the first time you're here, this is the show where we slow history down just enough to see the seams. Not just what happened, but who paid for it, who argued about it, and who ended up as a footnote. Today's episode covers February 7th through February 9th. And before we get to presidents, battles, sports legends, and cultural chaos, we return once more to the Potomac River. Because some stories don't end when the shot is fired. The gunshot that killed Berkeley Muse didn't just echo across the river. It reached courtrooms, newspapers, and legislative chambers. Public reaction in Virginia was immediate and intense. Editorials questioned why fisheries enforcement had become armed. Community leaders demanded accountability. Watermen argued that decades of unresolved jurisdiction had turned routine policing into something far more dangerous than it ever should have been. Legally, the aftermath was complicated. Maryland maintained its authority to enforce oyster laws. Virginia questioned whether that authority had crossed the line, geographically and morally. Jurisdiction blurred responsibility. Authority overlapped accountability. And the Oyster Wars, already an embarrassment to modern governance, became impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, something rare happened. Maryland and Virginia acknowledged the same uncomfortable truth. This could not continue. What enforcement couldn't fix, cooperation might. Discussions began. Not about punishment, but prevention. Not about control, but shared stewardship. Federal involvement followed, not to impose force, but to broker peace. Berkeley Muse didn't set out to become a turning point. But history doesn't require intention, only consequence. And after that night on the river, pretending the system worked was no longer an option. Friday we closed this story. But now, the rest of history. February 7th, the Cuba embargo of 1962. President John F. Kennedy signed an executive order imposing a full trade embargo on Cuba, turning Cold War tension into permanent economic policy. 60-plus years later, the embargo remains one of history's longest-running political grudges. In Vietnam, that escalated in 1965. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy recommended a policy of sustained reprisal. President Lyndon Johnson agreed, launching Operation Flaming Dart, the first direct U.S. airstrikes against North Vietnam. It was escalation by memo. And in 2002, President George W. Bush announced plans to allow federal funding for faith-based organizations providing social services, reigniting debates over church, state, and who gets to define help. In 2020, 2 days after his acquittal, President Donald Trump removed Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman and Ambassador Gordon Sondland. A reminder that testimony has consequences even when verdicts don't. In 1943, the Guadalcanal ends. Japan completed its evacuation under Operation Key, effectively conceding the island. The Pacific War shifted from defense to offense and never looked back. 1965, Operation Flaming Dart won. Carrier aircraft from the USS Hancock, Coral Sea, and Ranger struck North Vietnamese targets. The USS Coral Sea entered combat history on its very first mission. And in 1800, there was a naval milestone. The USS Essex became the first U.S. Navy ship to cross the equator, proving American sailors could get lost globally. And in 1964, the Beatles arrive. Pan Am Flight 101 landed in New York, carrying 4 young men and 1 cultural earthquake. Thousands of screaming fans, hundreds of reporters, and 6 days later, The Ed Sullivan Show. America was never musically same again. And February 8th, Confederate government formed in 1861. On this day, delegates from succeeding southern states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and adopted a provisional constitution for the Confederate States of America. This wasn't symbolic, it was administrative. Paperwork before gunfire, and once the government existed, war became inevitable. And in 1837, Richard Mentor Johnson became the only vice president in U.S. history elected by Senate after no candidate secured an electoral majority. It's the constitutional equivalent of saying, fine, we'll handle it. Messy, but legal. And 1962, the MACV established. The United States created the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. On paper, it coordinated advisors. In reality, it laid the bureaucratic foundation for a full-scale war. Wars don't always begin with battles. Sometimes they begin with organizational charts. In 1971, Operation Lam Son. South Vietnamese forces, backed by U.S. air power, entered Laos to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It failed, and in doing so, exposed just how fragile Vietnamization truly was. 1984, Lebanon bombardment. The USS New Jersey fired 288 shells into militia positions in Lebanon, the heaviest naval bombardment of that conflict. A reminder that escalation doesn't need speeches, just orders. And we get into sports, and the first NFL draft was 1936. It was held at the Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia. Jay Berwanger went first overall and never played a professional down. History's first draft lesson: potential is not a contract. And 1960, Bill Russell pulled down 50 rebounds in a single game. Not a typo. 50. Because Bill Russell treated physics as a suggestion. And at 5'7", Spud Webb defeated Dominic Wilkins in the win for NBA Slam Dunk Contest. Proof that gravity has a deductible. And 2023, LeBron James surpassed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as NBA's all-time leading scorer. Longevity met dominance and won. February 8th is one of those dates where history refuses to pick a lane. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed after nearly 2 decades of imprisonment. A reminder that royal blood never guaranteed mercy, especially when politics felt threatened. 1910, the Boy Scouts of America were officially founded, built on ideas of preparedness, citizenship, and moral character. Concepts meant to guide boys through a rapidly changing modern world. 1968, the Orangeburg Massacre shattered that idealism when South Carolina state troopers opened fire on black student protesters, killing 3 and wounding dozens. It remains one of the least discussed tragedies of the Civil Rights era. And in 1971, NASDAQ launched, quietly introducing the world's first electronic stock market, reshaping finance while most people barely noticed. February 8th reminds us that progress and tragedy don't alternate. They coexist, often uncomfortably, on the same calendar page. Then we get into February 9th, and that's what happens when power can't agree with itself. In 1825, John Quincy Adams became president after the House of Representatives stepped in, proving that American democracy has always included footnotes. 1861, Jefferson Davis was named provisional president of the Confederacy, transforming secession from protest into formal rebellion. 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed communists had infiltrated the State Department, igniting a Red Scare that would ruin careers long before evidence entered the room. And in 2021, Donald Trump's second impeachment trial began, another chapter in a long American tradition of arguing about power instead of resolving it. In 1943, Guadalcanal was declared secure. ending a brutal 6-month campaign that marked a turning point in the Pacific War. From that moment on, the Allies stopped reacting and started advancing. 2 years later, in 1945, the British submarine HMS Venturer sank the German U-boat U-864 off the coast of Norway, marking the only incident in naval history where one submerged submarine intentionally sank another. Using passive sonar to track the diving U-boat, Lieutenant Jimmy Launders of HMS Venturer calculated his position, firing 4 torpedoes that resulted in the destruction of U-864. Silent hunters, perfect calculations, a feat never repeated. And February 9th belongs to athletes who refuse to age quietly. 1971, Satchel Paige entered the Baseball Hall of Fame, finally recognizing brilliance that segregation tried to sideline. 1997, Michael Jordan recorded the first triple-double in NBA All-Star Game history. Even when it didn't count, Jordan made it count. February 9 also understands comfort and culture. It's National Bagel and Lox Day, proof that food traditions survive borders, migrations, and generations. 1964, the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, watched by 73 million people. No streaming, no replays, just a nation changing together in real time. Alice Walker, born in 1944, would grow into Pulitzer Prize-winning author and activist whose words reshaped American literature. And in 1995, Bernard Harris became the first black astronaut to walk in space, reminding us that history doesn't drift forward. It steps, deliberately, into places it was once told it didn't belong. This weekend's history reminds us that systems rarely fail all at once. They strain. They harden. They ignore warning signs. Whether it's a river with no shared rules, a war escalated by memo, or a culture changed by 4 voices on a stage, history moves when pressure meets reality. The family thread isn't about assigning heroes or villains. It's about recognizing the moment when pretending stops working. And next time, we listen for the echo. I'm Stan Miles, and this has been Dravin's Den.